My name is Rachel Bennett. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my life I believed family meant safety. I believed that no matter how difficult life became, the people who loved you would never quietly work against you behind closed doors. I was wrong. I'm a single mother living in Columbus, Ohio with my 9-year-old son, Ethan. After my divorce 3 years ago, life became busy but stable. I worked long hours as a medical billing coordinator at a private clinic while Ethan stayed with my older sister Linda every other weekend. Linda was 61, recently retired, and lived alone after her husband passed away from cancer. At first, helping with Ethan seemed to give her purpose again. She baked cookies with him, took him fishing at the lake near her neighborhood, and constantly posted photos online calling him my favorite little buddy. I was grateful because balancing work, bills, and parenting alone was exhausting. I thought Ethan spending time with family was a good thing. I had no idea those weekends were slowly changing the way my son saw me. The first signs were small enough to ignore. Ethan started comparing everything I did to Linda. If I ordered takeout after work, he'd say, "Aunt Linda cooks real dinners." If I forgot to sign a school paper one night because I was exhausted, he'd quietly say, "Aunt Linda never forgets things." It hurt, but I convinced myself kids repeat whatever adults say around them. Then he began asking strange questions. One night while I tucked him into bed, he asked, "Mom, if a kid's parent works too much, can they go live somewhere else?" I laughed nervously and asked where he heard that. He shrugged and said, "Just wondering." But something about the way he avoided my eyes stayed with me all night. Things became worse during the spring semester. Ethan's 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Collins, emailed asking if I could stop by after school. She said Ethan had written something concerning during a classroom writing activity. I thought maybe he'd gotten into a fight or written something inappropriate. Instead, Mrs. Collins handed me a blue spiral notebook and pointed to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. Ethan's handwriting was messy and uneven, but the sentence was clear enough to make my stomach drop. "Aunt Linda says someday I might live with her because moms who are too busy can lose kids." I stared at the page for several seconds before reading the next paragraph. Ethan wrote about practice talks where Linda told him what to say if people asked whether he felt lonely at my apartment. Another page described a bedroom Linda had redecorated just for him. He wrote, "She says it will be my real room one day." I felt cold all over. Mrs. Collins spoke gently, explaining that school staff are trained to report emotional concerns involving children. She said Ethan often looked anxious on Mondays after weekends with Linda and sometimes worried aloud about whether parents could give kids away. Hearing that nearly broke me. I drove straight from the school to Linda's house without calling first. Her home sat in a quiet neighborhood outside Dublin, Ohio. I'd been there hundreds of times, but that afternoon it felt unfamiliar. The front door was unlocked like always. I walked through the hallway and immediately noticed framed photos of Ethan everywhere. Pictures from birthdays, vacations, and holidays covered the walls. Most of them barely included me. In several photos I had clearly been cropped out. My chest tightened as I continued toward the guest room at the end of the hall. It wasn't a guest room anymore. The walls were painted dark blue, Ethan's favorite color. A wooden sign above the bed read Ethan's room. There were new clothes hanging in the closet, shelves filled with toys, and school supplies neatly stacked on a desk beside the window. On the dresser sat a photo album labeled "Our Little Family." My hand shook as I opened it. Page after page showed Linda and Ethan together at parks, restaurants, and movie nights. Some photos originally included me, but my face had been cut away or folded under decorative stickers. The final page was blank except for one handwritten sentence, "Fresh start coming soon." Then I found the folder. Inside were printouts about grandparents' custody rights in Ohio, notes from a family attorney consultation, and information packets from a private elementary school near Linda's house. One page had highlighted text discussing how unstable work schedules could affect custody arrangements. My breathing became shallow as I flipped through everything. That's when I heard Linda come through the garage door. She froze when she saw me standing in the room holding the folder. For a second she looked embarrassed. Then her expression hardened. "You shouldn't be snooping through my things," she snapped. I held up the papers. "What is this?" She crossed her arms. "Someone has to think about Ethan's future. You work constantly, Rachel. That boy spends more time with babysitters than with you. He's my son. And I'm the one giving him stability," she said coldly. "He's happier here." I remember staring at her, realizing this wasn't some emotional fantasy she secretly carried. She had actually been planning something. Slowly. Quietly. 4 months. That night after Ethan fell asleep, I read every page of his notebook. I noticed a pattern immediately. Every disturbing entry came right after weekends at Linda's house. The language became more serious over time. At first Ethan sounded confused. Later he sounded convinced. Linda had been feeding him a story piece by piece until he began believing it himself. Over the next week I started noticing other things. Ethan's old tablet constantly buzzed with notifications from a shared family group chat I didn't recognize. One evening while he showered, I looked at the messages. What I found made me physically sick. The group was called Planning Ahead. Members included Linda, my cousin Sharon, and my Aunt Denise. For months they had been discussing me behind my back. Screenshots of my texts were shared as proof that I worked too much. Linda updated them after every conversation with Ethan. They discussed lawyers, schools, and even how Ethan should answer questions if anyone asked whether he preferred living with her. One message from Linda read, "He already trusts me more than Rachel. It's only a matter of time." I took screenshots of everything. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was realizing how long I ignored my instincts because I didn't want to believe family could do something like this. A week later Linda hosted a large family barbecue for her birthday. Nearly everyone attended, cousins, neighbors, church friends, relatives I hadn't seen in years. She greeted guests like nothing had happened. She hugged people, laughed loudly, and played the role of loving aunt perfectly. Then during dinner she stood up holding a glass of wine and started crying in front of everyone. She talked about loneliness after losing her husband. She talked about how much Ethan meant to her. Then she looked directly at me and said, "I just wish Rachel would stop keeping Ethan away from me." The room instantly turned toward me. People frowned. A few relatives shook their heads sympathetically toward Linda. She had prepared this moment carefully. She expected me to stay quiet because I usually avoided conflict. Instead, I calmly stood up and placed Ethan's blue notebook in the middle of the table. I told them about the school meeting. I read Ethan's sentence aloud. "Aunt Linda says someday I might live with her because moms who are too busy can lose kids." The entire table went silent. Then I described the room, the lawyer papers, the photo album, and the group chat. Linda tried interrupting several times, but I kept speaking. Finally I placed printed screenshots from the chat beside the notebook so everyone could read them themselves. One of Linda's church friends quietly removed her glasses and stared at the messages in shock. My Aunt Denise turned pale. My cousin Sharon suddenly became very interested in her plate. Linda's face completely changed. The sweet grieving widow act disappeared instantly. She stood up screaming that I was humiliating her on purpose. She accused me of being selfish and unstable. But by then the room had already shifted. People weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at her. My grandfather's sister, Eleanor, who almost never spoke during family gatherings, looked directly at Linda and said, "Trying to replace a child's mother is not love." Nobody defended her after that. I left before dessert was served. The following month I officially ended unsupervised visits between Linda and Ethan. I also met with a family attorney who assured me Linda had no realistic custody case. Ethan began seeing a child therapist who helped him understand that adults should never ask children to keep emotional secrets from their parents. Slowly, things improved. Ethan stopped asking whether kids could lose their moms. He stopped comparing every part of our life to Linda's house. One evening while we ate frozen pizza in our tiny apartment, he smiled and said, "I like it better here because it feels calm." That sentence healed something inside me. Linda still sends birthday cards sometimes. I don't hate her. Part of me understands her grief and loneliness. But grief does not give someone permission to manipulate a child or destroy trust between a parent and their kid. Some people don't try to steal your life loudly. They do it slowly, smiling the entire time while convincing themselves they're helping. And sometimes protecting your child means finally accepting that even family can cross a line you can never allow again. The biggest lesson I learned is this: when a child suddenly becomes fearful, anxious, or emotionally distant, listen carefully. Kids may not always explain things clearly, but their behavior often tells the truth long before adults are ready to hear it.